Some secrets stay hidden for 30 years. Others reveal themselves with a single sentence. The rain tapped softly against the tall windows of the Hawthorne Room, one of Chicago's most exclusive restaurants. Crystal chandeliers reflected warm golden light across polished marble floors. Conversations drifted through the room in low, careful tones. Deals worth millions were discussed over steaks and wine. At the center of it all sat Benjamin Crawford, the richest man in Chicago, a man whose name appeared on skyscrapers, hospitals, and university buildings throughout the city. At 42, Benjamin had become a symbol of success. People admired him. Competitors feared him. Journalists followed his every move. Yet tonight, as he sat alone at his usual corner table overlooking Michigan Avenue, he seemed distracted. His untouched coffee had already gone cold. His eyes drifted occasionally toward the rain beyond the glass. The city lights blurred into long streaks of gold and silver. For a brief moment, Benjamin looked less like a billionaire and more like a man carrying something heavy, something invisible. A waitress approached quietly. Her name was Grace Whitmore, 28 years old, blonde hair neatly tied back, calm blue eyes, the kind of person most guests barely noticed. She moved with quiet confidence, carrying a fresh cup of coffee balanced effortlessly on a silver tray. She had worked at the Hawthorne Room for almost 3 years, long enough to learn that powerful people often revealed more in silence than in conversation. "Fresh coffee, Mr. Crawford," she said softly. Benjamin nodded without looking up from a document resting beside his plate. "Thank you." Grace carefully replaced the cold cup. As she reached forward, something caught her attention. A watch. Old. Elegant. Silver. Its leather strap had clearly been replaced more than once. The glass showed tiny marks from decades of use. It looked strangely out of place among Benjamin's custom-tailored suit and modern luxury accessories. Her eyes lingered for a moment longer than they should have. Then she froze. Not dramatically, not visibly, just enough for her hand to pause above the table. Benjamin noticed. "Something wrong?" he asked. Grace hesitated. The dining room suddenly felt quieter. The rain seemed louder. She looked at the watch again. Then she spoke. "That's a beautiful watch." Benjamin gave a polite nod. "It belonged to my father." Grace's expression changed slightly. Not surprise. Recognition. "I thought so." Benjamin finally looked up. "Excuse me." Grace swallowed carefully. "I'm sorry. It's just..." She glanced down at the watch once more. "I saw that watch before." Benjamin frowned immediately. "That's impossible." Grace almost smiled. "Maybe." Benjamin sat back slowly. "My father passed away a long time ago." Grace nodded. "I know." A strange silence settled between them. Benjamin's eyes narrowed. "How would you know that?" Grace looked toward the rain-covered windows. Her voice became quieter, more distant, as if she were remembering something she had not thought about in years. "Because the man who wore that watch spent 3 nights sleeping on a wooden bench at Union Station." Benjamin's hand stopped moving. The room seemed to disappear around him. The conversations, the music, the clinking glasses. Gone. "What did you just say?" Grace met his gaze. Calmly. "I said the man who wore that watch spent 3 nights at Union Station." Benjamin stared at her. His heartbeat suddenly felt louder than the storm outside. "That's not possible." Grace lowered her eyes. "Maybe it isn't." Then she added the sentence that would change everything. "But I still remember what he said while staring at that watch." Benjamin felt the color leave his face. "And what did he say?" Grace looked directly at him. "He said he hoped his son would someday learn the truth." For several seconds, neither of them moved. Benjamin Crawford remained seated, his hand resting beside the silver watch. The rain continued sliding down the windows behind him, turning the lights of Chicago into blurred streaks of gold. Grace Whitmore stood quietly beside the table, suddenly aware that every word she spoke next could change something she did not yet understand. Benjamin finally broke the silence. "My father died 27 years ago." His voice was calm, but only on the surface. Grace nodded slowly. "That is what everyone believed." Benjamin stared at her. "Everyone." Grace lowered her eyes for a moment. She had not planned to tell this story tonight. In truth, she had not thought about it for years. Yet the watch had pulled the memory back with perfect clarity. "My grandmother worked at Union Station," she said. "She managed a small newsstand near Track 12. Benjamin listened without speaking. "When I was 8 years old, she used to bring me with her during school breaks. I spent hours sitting behind the counter drawing pictures, and watching travelers come and go. A faint smile touched her lips. Most people were forgettable. Businessmen, tourists, families. But there was one man she always noticed. Benjamin felt his chest tighten. Grace continued. He arrived during a storm, just like this one. He carried one small leather bag. Nothing else. He sat on the same bench every evening. Benjamin looked toward the watch again. And you remember him? I remember the watch. Her answer came immediately. Because it was beautiful, old-fashioned, different from anything I had seen before. The restaurant around them continued operating normally. Glasses clinked. Waiters moved between tables. Somewhere in the distance, soft piano music filled the room. Yet Benjamin heard none of it. Grace's voice had become the only thing that mattered. My grandmother spoke with him several times, she said. He was polite, quiet, sad. Benjamin swallowed carefully. Did he tell her his name? Grace shook her head. No, at least not at first. Benjamin leaned forward. What happened? Grace hesitated. On the third night, my grandmother found him sitting alone after closing time. He had been staring at that watch for nearly an hour. Benjamin felt a strange chill despite the warmth of the room. And Grace looked directly into his eyes. He asked her a question. What question? He asked whether a son could forgive a father for disappearing. Benjamin froze. The words landed harder than he expected. His father had never disappeared. That was the story he had been told. The story repeated by relatives, lawyers, reporters, and eventually by history itself. Grace continued quietly. My grandmother told him that children often forgive more than adults think. Benjamin said nothing. The man smiled when she said that. Grace looked toward the rain-covered glass. Then he opened his wallet and showed her a photograph. Benjamin's heartbeat quickened. A photograph of who? Grace took a slow breath. A little boy. Benjamin felt the air leave his lungs. About 7 years old. The silence stretched between them. Holding a toy train, Benjamin stared at her. He had one photograph exactly like that. It still sat inside a locked drawer in his penthouse. A picture taken when he was 7 years old. A picture almost no one had ever seen. Grace noticed the change in his expression immediately. And for the first time that evening, she realized this was no coincidence. Whatever story had begun at Union Station all those years ago had somehow found its way back to Benjamin Crawford. Benjamin did not realize he was gripping the edge of the table until his knuckles turned pale. Outside, the rain continued falling across downtown Chicago, but inside the Hawthorne room, time seemed to slow. He looked away from Grace and toward the dark reflection in the window. A 7-year-old boy holding a toy train. The image had followed him his entire life. It sat inside a cedar box in his penthouse library, alongside a handful of items he never showed anyone. Not even his closest advisors. Not even the people who had known him for decades. That photograph does not exist anywhere public, Benjamin said quietly. Grace nodded. I figured that much. Then how could your grandmother have seen it? Grace folded her hands in front of her apron. Because the man showed it to her himself. Benjamin stared at the silver watch resting beside his coffee. For years, he had believed he understood his family history. His father, Thomas Crawford, had disappeared when Benjamin was 8 years old. The official explanation never changed. Business pressure, personal problems, a decision to walk away. Newspapers repeated it. Relatives repeated it. Eventually Benjamin repeated it to himself. Children needed answers, even imperfect ones. Especially imperfect ones. Yet tonight, for the first time in decades, cracks were beginning to appear in that carefully constructed story. Tell me everything your grandmother remembered, he said. Grace hesitated. It is not much. Tell me anyway. She glanced toward the dining room manager, who gave her a subtle nod. Even he sensed something unusual was unfolding. Grace turned back to Benjamin. My grandmother said the man carried a leather bag that looked expensive but worn. He never spent much money. He ordered black coffee every evening. Benjamin listened carefully. Anything else? Grace nodded. He wrote letters. Letters. Every night. Benjamin frowned. To who? She never knew. Grace paused. But she said he never mailed them. Benjamin felt a strange unease settle over him. What happened to the letters? According to her, he kept them inside the bag. The piano music shifted to a slower melody somewhere across the room. Grace lowered her voice. On the third night, he left something behind. Benjamin looked up immediately. What? A drawing. Benjamin blinked. A drawing? Made with a pencil. Grace looked toward the window, as though seeing the memory herself. My grandmother said it was folded inside a newspaper. She found it after he left. Benjamin could feel his heartbeat growing louder. Do you still have it? Grace did not answer right away. Instead, she reached into the pocket of her apron and touched something hidden inside. Benjamin noticed the movement instantly. Grace. She met his gaze. Calm. Careful. After my grandmother passed away 5 years ago, I inherited a small wooden box. Benjamin sat perfectly still, and Grace slowly withdrew a yellowed envelope. The edges were worn from age. The paper had darkened with time. Benjamin felt his breath catch. Grace placed the envelope on the table between them. The drawing was inside. Neither of them moved. The envelope sat beside the silver watch, one carrying the weight of the present, the other carrying the weight of the past. And Benjamin suddenly understood that whatever happened next might change everything he thought he knew about his father. Benjamin looked at the envelope for a long moment without touching it. The yellowed paper seemed impossibly ordinary. Just an old envelope. Just a forgotten object that had survived the passing of years. Yet somehow it carried more weight than billion-dollar contracts and corporate acquisitions. Grace remained silent. She understood that some moments needed room to breathe. Finally, Benjamin reached forward. His fingers brushed the edge of the envelope. Carefully, almost reluctantly, he opened it. Inside was a single folded sheet of paper. The pencil marks had faded but remained visible. Benjamin unfolded it slowly. The moment he saw the drawing, his entire body went still. It was a train, a simple sketch. Nothing extraordinary. Yet every detail was familiar. The curved roof, the small conductor window, the uneven wheels. Benjamin had drawn that train himself when he was 7 years old. He knew because he had made the same mistake every time. One wheel was always slightly larger than the others. His elementary school teacher used to tease him about it. Benjamin stared at the paper, then stared harder. His throat tightened. "This cannot be real," he whispered. Grace watched his expression carefully. "You recognize it?" Benjamin nodded without looking up. "I drew this." For the first time that evening, uncertainty appeared in Grace's eyes. "You are sure?" Benjamin let out a slow breath. "Absolutely." He turned the paper over. On the back was a handwritten note. The ink had faded but remained readable. Benjamin immediately recognized the handwriting. He had not seen it in decades, yet recognition arrived instantly. Some things never truly leave us. His father had written only one sentence. "To the boy who deserves the truth." Benjamin felt a chill run through him. The handwriting was identical to the birthday cards he kept locked away in storage. The cards his father had written before disappearing from his life. Grace noticed the color leave his face. "What does it say?" Benjamin swallowed carefully. For a moment he could not answer. Then he handed her the paper. Grace read the sentence quietly. The words seemed to settle between them like falling snow. Neither spoke. Across the dining room, life continued as normal. Waiters served meals. Guests laughed softly over wine. A businessman shook hands with a client near the entrance. Yet for Benjamin, the entire room felt distant. He looked at the drawing again. "My father kept this." Grace nodded. "Apparently." Benjamin leaned back slowly. Questions filled his mind. Too many questions. If his father had carried this drawing all those years later, then he had not forgotten. If he had not forgotten, then why had he never returned? Why had he never called? Why had he never explained anything? Grace seemed to sense the storm building behind his eyes. "My grandmother always believed he wanted to come back." Benjamin looked at her sharply. "Why?" Grace folded her hands. "Because every night he talked about his son." Benjamin said nothing. "She told me he spoke about him constantly." Grace's voice softened. Not like someone running away. More like someone searching for a way home. Benjamin looked down at the watch. Then the drawing. Then the rain beyond the glass. For 34 years, he had believed one story. Tonight that story was beginning to unravel thread by thread. And somewhere beneath it, another truth was waiting. Benjamin remained seated long after the drawing had been folded and placed back inside the envelope. His coffee had gone untouched. The ice in a nearby water glass had completely melted. Yet neither seemed important anymore. He looked across the restaurant, but he was not really seeing it. His mind had drifted backward through time. Back to the large stone house where he grew up. Back to family dinners that always felt carefully controlled. Back to the day his father vanished from his life. "There is something else," Grace said quietly. Benjamin looked up. "What?" Grace hesitated. My grandmother kept a journal. Benjamin immediately focused on her. A journal about him? Not entirely. She shook her head. She wrote about many people she met at the station. Travelers, workers, strangers. Her eyes lowered briefly, but she mentioned him several times. Benjamin felt a cautious spark of hope. Do you still have it? Grace nodded. At home. The answer arrived softly, yet it carried enormous weight. Benjamin leaned back in his chair. For years, he had hired investigators, historians, and private researchers. None had ever uncovered anything meaningful. Yet tonight, a waitress carrying an old family memory had revealed more than all of them combined. Why did you never look into this before? He asked. Grace offered a small smile. Because until tonight, I never knew who he was. Benjamin glanced toward the envelope again. You never wondered? Of course I wondered. She folded her hands together. But it always felt like someone else's story. She paused. Now I am not so sure. Benjamin studied her face. There was sincerity there. No hidden agenda. No request for money. No attempt to impress him. Just quiet honesty. It was strangely refreshing. A quality he encountered less and less these days. Outside, the rain had begun to slow. The city lights looked sharper now, their reflections stretching across the wet streets below. Benjamin's phone suddenly vibrated on the table. He glanced at the screen. 3 missed calls. 2 urgent emails. A message from his chief executive officer. Under normal circumstances, he would have answered immediately. Tonight, he silenced the phone without reading any of them. Grace noticed. Important. Usually. He gave a faint smile. Not tonight. For the first time, Grace laughed softly. The sound surprised both of them. Benjamin realized he had not laughed much lately either. Success had a way of filling every available space until nothing else remained. Another thought surfaced, one that refused to leave. You said your grandmother believed he wanted to come home. Grace nodded. Yes. Benjamin stared toward the window. Then why did he not? Grace looked thoughtful. Maybe because he could not. The answer lingered between them. Benjamin had spent most of his life assuming choice. Assuming abandonment. Assuming his father simply walked away. But what if there had been another reason? What if the story he inherited had been incomplete from the beginning? Grace reached into her apron pocket once more and removed a small folded note. There was one thing my grandmother wrote that always stayed with me. Benjamin looked at her carefully. What was it? Grace unfolded the paper. The handwriting was old and slightly faded. She read the sentence quietly. Some people disappear because they want to be forgotten. Others disappear because somebody wants their story forgotten. Benjamin felt something shift deep inside him. And for the first time in 34 years, he began to wonder whether his father's disappearance had never been the mystery. Perhaps the real mystery was who had benefited from it. The restaurant had begun to empty by the time Benjamin finally stood from his chair. The storm outside had weakened to a light drizzle, but inside him, another storm was only beginning. He looked at the envelope one last time before carefully placing it inside his briefcase. The drawing, the note, the memory of a man sitting alone in Union Station. None of it made sense. Yet all of it felt real. More real than the version of history he had carried for most of his life. Grace was collecting menus from a nearby table when Benjamin approached her again. What time does your shift end? She looked surprised by the question. About 30 minutes. Benjamin nodded. Would you be willing to show me the journal tonight? Grace studied him carefully. Most wealthy people she encountered were accustomed to immediate answers. Immediate results. Immediate access. Benjamin seemed different now. Not powerful. Not intimidating. Just determined. You really want to see it tonight? She asked. I do. Grace glanced toward the rain-speckled windows. Then I think you should. 45 minutes later, they were driving north through quiet Chicago streets. Benjamin sat behind the wheel of a black sedan instead of using a driver. He wanted silence. He wanted space to think. The city lights reflected across wet pavement as they passed old brick buildings, corner diners, and apartment blocks glowing softly in the darkness. Grace lived in a modest 3-story building near Lincoln Square. Nothing extravagant. Nothing designed to impress anyone. Inside, the apartment felt warm and lived in. Books lined the shelves. Framed family photographs rested on wooden tables. A small lamp cast golden light across the living room. Benjamin immediately noticed something unusual. The apartment felt honest. The kind of place where memories mattered more than appearances. Grace disappeared briefly down a hallway, and returned carrying a worn wooden box. Benjamin recognized it instantly, not because he had seen it before, because it felt connected to everything else. The watch, the drawing, the unanswered questions. Grace placed the box on the coffee table between them. Neither spoke for several seconds. Then she slowly opened it. Inside were photographs, letters, newspaper clippings, ticket stubs, and a dark blue journal with faded corners. Grace carefully lifted the journal into her hands. "This is it." Benjamin leaned forward. His pulse quickened. Grace opened to a page marked with a ribbon. The handwriting filled nearly every inch. Neat, precise, patient. She began reading aloud. October 14th. The gentleman with the silver watch returned tonight. He seemed exhausted. We spoke for nearly an hour. He asked if I believe truth eventually finds its way home. Benjamin felt a chill. Grace continued. He said there are powerful people who can control newspapers, lawyers, and public opinion, but they cannot control time forever. Benjamin exchanged a glance with her. Neither said anything. Grace turned the page. Then another. Suddenly she stopped. Her expression changed. "What is it?" Benjamin asked. Grace stared at the journal. "I do not remember seeing this before." Benjamin moved closer. Folded between the pages was a photograph. Old, slightly faded. Grace carefully removed it. The moment Benjamin saw the image, his breath caught. It showed his father standing beside another man. Both smiling. Both much younger. The photograph itself was not surprising. The face beside his father was. Benjamin knew that face. Everyone in Chicago knew that face. It belonged to his uncle Richard Crawford, the man who had taken control of the family business only weeks after Thomas Crawford disappeared. And suddenly, for the first time, Benjamin began to wonder whether the answers he was searching for had been much closer than he ever imagined. Benjamin could not take his eyes off the photograph. The image was small, slightly faded, ordinary to anyone else. But to him, it felt like a crack opening beneath decades of certainty. Richard Crawford, his uncle, his mentor, the man who had taught him business, discipline, and responsibility after his father disappeared. The man who had stepped forward when no one else did. Grace carefully placed the photograph on the coffee table. Neither spoke for several seconds. The silence felt heavy, thoughtful, dangerous. "When was this taken?" Benjamin finally asked. Grace examined the back of the photograph. There was a handwritten date in blue ink. April 1992. Benjamin frowned immediately. "That cannot be right." Grace looked up. "Why not?" Benjamin leaned forward. "Because according to every official record, my father disappeared in 1991. The room grew quiet again. Grace glanced toward the journal. "Then either the date is wrong." She paused. "Or the story is." Benjamin looked away. Across the apartment, an old clock ticked softly against the wall. Each second seemed louder than the last. His mind raced through memories he had not revisited in years. Family gatherings, corporate meetings, conversations with lawyers, newspaper interviews. Every version of the story had remained identical. Thomas Crawford left. Richard Crawford stayed. One brother disappeared. The other saved the company. It was a narrative everyone accepted, including Benjamin, especially Benjamin. Grace slowly opened the journal again. There might be more. Together they began turning pages. Most entries described ordinary station life. Travelers rushing for trains. Weather reports. Small observations. Then Grace stopped. A folded newspaper clipping had slipped from between two pages. Benjamin picked it up. The article came from a local paper dated November 1992. The headline was simple. Regional business leader announces expansion plans. Beneath it was a photograph of Richard Crawford standing in front of the company headquarters. Benjamin had seen the image before. It was often displayed in corporate archives. What caught his attention was a handwritten note in the margin, not from a journalist, from Grace's grandmother. Benjamin read the words twice. Then a third time. Richard visited today, asked questions about the gentleman with the watch. Seemed relieved when he learned the man had already left town. Benjamin slowly lowered the clipping. Relieved. Grace nodded. That is an odd word. Benjamin stared at the paper. Very odd. His uncle had always claimed he spent years searching for Thomas. Years trying to bring him home. Years trying to find answers. Yet according to this note, Richard already knew his brother had been alive after the disappearance. More than that, he seemed relieved when the trail ended. Benjamin felt something uncomfortable settle inside him. Doubt. Not certainty. Not proof. Just doubt. and doubt could be surprisingly powerful. Grace watched him carefully. "What are you thinking?" Benjamin answered honestly. "I am thinking that I may have trusted the wrong version of my family's history." Rain tapped softly against the windows again. Somewhere outside, a train whistle echoed faintly through the night. Both of them turned instinctively toward the sound. Then Grace noticed something sticking out from the back cover of the journal. A sealed envelope, older than everything else. Its paper had yellowed with age. Across the front, written in careful handwriting, were 6 words that made Benjamin's heart stop. For Benjamin. To be opened someday. Neither of them touched the envelope immediately. It rested on the coffee table beneath the warm glow of the lamp, small enough to fit in one hand, yet somehow larger than every question that had surfaced that night. Benjamin stared at the familiar handwriting. He had seen those careful strokes before. Birthday cards, notes tucked into lunchboxes, a short letter sent from a business trip when he was 6 years old. Memories he had spent years protecting from disappointment. Grace sat quietly across from him. She understood that some discoveries could not be rushed. Finally, Benjamin reached forward and picked up the envelope. The paper felt fragile. Time had left its mark. For a brief moment, he simply held it. Then he carefully opened the seal. Inside was a folded letter. Only 2 pages. Benjamin unfolded them slowly. The first line immediately stole the air from the room. "If you are reading this, then someone kind finally carried the truth farther than I could." Benjamin stopped breathing for a moment. Grace watched his eyes move across the page. "What does it say?" she asked softly. Benjamin continued reading. The letter was written by Thomas Crawford. There was no doubt about it. Every sentence carried the same voice Benjamin remembered from childhood. Calm, thoughtful, measured, as though speaking directly across the years. Thomas explained that he had left Chicago voluntarily, but not for the reasons people believed. He wrote that remaining would have placed someone else in danger. He never explained exactly who. Not yet. Instead, he described months spent traveling from town to town, trying to solve a problem he could not discuss publicly. Benjamin turned the page. His pulse quickened. Then he reached a sentence that made him freeze. "The greatest mistake of my life was trusting the wrong person with the truth." Grace immediately noticed the change in his expression. "Benjamin." He looked up slowly. "My father was betrayed." The words hung in the room. Grace remained silent. Benjamin lowered his eyes back to the page. Thomas never mentioned Richard by name, yet several references pointed toward someone close. Someone inside the family. Someone who knew details no outsider could have known. Then Benjamin reached the final paragraph. His father described leaving something hidden. Not money, not company records. Something far more important. Proof. Evidence that would explain everything. The location was described using only a few clues. A train station. A locker. A number connected to an anniversary date. Thomas ended the letter with one final sentence. "The key is where your mother always waited for me." Benjamin lowered the paper slowly. The room felt completely still. "Your mother?" Grace asked. Benjamin nodded. "Union Station." Grace frowned. "How do you know?" A faint smile appeared for the first time in hours. "Because before they married, my father used to meet my mother there every Friday evening after work." Grace sat forward. Then he left something behind. Benjamin looked at the letter, then at the journal, then toward the dark apartment window where the city lights shimmered in the distance. For 34 years he had searched for answers without realizing his father had already left a trail. Not for investigators, not for lawyers, for him. And somewhere inside Union Station, hidden beneath decades of dust and forgotten memories, something was still waiting. Benjamin barely slept. Long after he returned home, the letter remained open on the desk of his penthouse library. The city stretched beyond the glass walls in a sea of lights, but his attention never left the handwritten pages. Every sentence raised new questions. Every answer seemed to uncover another mystery. By 6 o'clock the next morning, he was already dressed and standing outside Union Station. The building looked different than he remembered. Larger somehow. Older. Time had left its fingerprints on every stone and every window. Commuters hurried past carrying coffee cups and briefcases. None of them realized that one man was walking through the station searching for a promise left behind more than 3 decades earlier. Grace arrived a few minutes later carrying the journal inside a canvas bag. "You actually came," she said with a small smile. Benjamin looked at her. "After everything we found, there was no chance I was staying home." Together they stepped inside. The station buzzed with the rhythm of ordinary life. Announcements echoed overhead. Travelers moved between platforms. Shoes clicked across polished floors. Yet beneath the noise, Benjamin felt something else. A strange sense of familiarity, as though he had been walking toward this moment his entire life. They followed the clues from the letter carefully. Thomas had mentioned an anniversary date. Benjamin immediately recognized it. June 18th, the date his parents met. Grace helped calculate the corresponding locker number based on another clue hidden inside the letter. When they finally reached the old storage area near the lower level, both stopped walking. Locker 618 stood quietly among dozens of others. Benjamin stared at it. This cannot be real. Grace glanced at him. Only one way to find out. Benjamin removed the silver watch from his pocket. The watch had not left his side since that first conversation at the restaurant. Turning it over, he noticed something he had never examined closely before. Tiny engraved numbers along the inner clasp. Numbers that matched the final code described in the letter. His hands trembled slightly as he entered them into the lock. For a moment, nothing happened. Then a soft click echoed through the corridor. The locker door opened. Both stood frozen. Inside was not a box of evidence. Not financial records. Not legal documents. Instead, there was a single leather portfolio. Benjamin carefully lifted it out. The leather had aged but remained intact. Across the front were 3 words stamped in gold. Family trust records. Benjamin frowned immediately. This was not what he expected. Grace looked equally confused. What does it mean? Benjamin slowly opened the portfolio. The first pages contained financial statements from decades earlier. Company ownership records. Legal filings. Partnership agreements. Then he reached a page that made him stop breathing. A transfer document. Dated 6 months before Thomas disappeared. According to the record, Thomas Crawford had quietly transferred a substantial percentage of his ownership shares to someone else. Benjamin read the name twice. Then a third time. His uncle Richard was not listed anywhere. The shares had been transferred instead to a woman named Eleanor Whitmore. Grace stared at the document. Whitmore. Benjamin looked at her slowly. That is your last name. The station noise seemed to fade away around them. Grace took the papers with shaking hands. Her eyes scanned the page again. Then again. Neither understood exactly what they were looking at. But one thing had become impossible to ignore. Grace Whitmore was somehow connected to this story long before either of them ever walked into that restaurant. For several moments, neither Benjamin nor Grace spoke. The noise of Union Station returned gradually, as though the world had been paused and was only now beginning to move again. Travelers walked past. Announcements echoed overhead. Somewhere nearby, a train arrived with a low metallic hum. Yet both remained focused on the document in Grace's hands. Eleanor Whitmore. The name felt strangely familiar to Grace. Not because she knew the woman personally, but because she had heard it before. As a child. At family gatherings. In old conversations between relatives who assumed she was not listening. My grandmother's first name was Eleanor, Grace said quietly. Benjamin looked at her immediately. Your grandmother? Grace nodded. Eleanor Whitmore. Benjamin felt another piece of the puzzle slide into place. Slowly, carefully, not enough to reveal the full picture, just enough to suggest one existed. They returned to Grace's apartment that afternoon carrying copies of every document from the portfolio. The kitchen table soon disappeared beneath stacks of papers. Ownership records, legal filings, tax statements, correspondence. Benjamin had spent decades reading corporate documents. Patterns revealed themselves quickly to him, and one pattern immediately stood out. Thomas Crawford had not simply transferred shares to Eleanor Whitmore. He had transferred them into a protected trust, a trust designed to remain hidden until certain conditions were met. Why would he do that? Grace asked. Benjamin studied a page covered with legal language. Because he wanted to protect something. Or someone. Benjamin looked up. Grace was staring at another document. Her expression had changed. What is it? She slid the paper across the table. Benjamin read the first paragraph. Then the second. His pulse quickened. The trust listed a future beneficiary. Not Eleanor. Not Thomas. Not Richard. The beneficiary was identified only as the direct descendant of Eleanor Whitmore. Grace felt her stomach tighten. That means, Benjamin nodded slowly. It means the trust eventually belongs to you. Silence settled over the room. Grace leaned back in her chair. That is impossible. Benjamin almost smiled. I have said that at least 10 times since yesterday. Grace stared at the documents spread before them. She worked double shifts to pay rent. She lived in a modest apartment. She worried about grocery prices and utility bills. The idea that her family had any connection to one of Chicago's most influential business dynasties felt absurd. Yet the paperwork sitting in front of her was impossible to ignore. Benjamin continued reading, then suddenly stopped. His eyes narrowed. Wait. Grace looked up. What? Benjamin turned the page. Attached to the final section was a notarized statement signed by Thomas Crawford. The date was only 3 weeks before his disappearance. Benjamin read the words silently. Then once more, this time slower. Grace could see the emotion building behind his calm expression. Benjamin. He looked up. My father finally explains why he trusted your grandmother. Grace sat forward. Why? Benjamin swallowed carefully. The answer felt almost unbelievable. Because she saved someone he loved. Grace frowned. Who? Benjamin lowered his eyes back to the page. Then he spoke the sentence exactly as written. Eleanor Whitmore protected my wife when nobody else would. Both of them froze. Grace stared at him. Benjamin stared at the document. And for the first time, they realized this story was no longer about a missing businessman. It was about two families whose lives had been connected long before either of them had been born. The next 3 days passed in a blur of documents, phone calls, and discoveries. Benjamin had access to some of the best legal minds in Chicago, but for the first time in his life, he kept the investigation small, quiet, private. The fewer people involved, the safer the truth remained. Every new document seemed to confirm the same thing. Thomas Crawford had never abandoned his family. He had been building a protected path back to them, a path hidden inside trusts, letters, and legal safeguards that only time could unlock. Yet one question still remained unanswered. Why had Richard Crawford spent decades protecting a completely different story? Late on the third evening, Benjamin sat in his office overlooking the Chicago River. The city glowed beneath the night sky. Grace sat across from him reviewing another stack of records when a notification appeared on Benjamin's computer screen. One of his researchers had located archived court filings that had never been digitized, documents forgotten inside county storage for more than 30 years. Benjamin opened the files immediately. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Corporate disputes, partnership agreements, routine legal paperwork. Then he found a deposition transcript. His eyes narrowed. Grace. She looked up. What is it? Benjamin slowly turned the screen toward her. A name appeared repeatedly throughout the testimony. Richard Crawford. Beside it was another name neither of them recognized. Samuel Whitmore. Grace felt her heart skip. Whitmore. Benjamin nodded. Do you know him? Grace shook her head. No. Together they read further. Samuel Whitmore had once worked as an accountant for the Crawford family business. More importantly, he was Eleanor Whitmore's husband. Grace stared at the page. My grandfather. Benjamin leaned back slowly. The realization settled over both of them at the same time. Their families had not crossed paths by accident. They had been connected for generations. Grace continued reading until she reached a statement buried deep inside the transcript. Then she froze. Benjamin. Her voice had changed. You need to see this. Benjamin moved beside her. The testimony described a private meeting held months before Thomas disappeared. Present at the meeting were Thomas Crawford, Richard Crawford, and Samuel Whitmore. According to the witness, the discussion involved financial irregularities inside the company, records that did not match official reports, money that had been moved without authorization. Benjamin read the paragraph twice. Then a third time. Richard's name appeared repeatedly. Yet no formal investigation had ever occurred. No public inquiry. No charges. Nothing. The entire matter had simply vanished. Grace looked at him carefully. Your father discovered something. Benjamin nodded slowly. And my grandfather helped him document it. The room fell silent. Suddenly, dozens of scattered clues began connecting. The hidden trust. The letters. The secrecy. The protection. Thomas had not been running from his family. He had been trying to protect them while preserving evidence. Benjamin walked toward the office window and looked out across the city. For decades he had admired his uncle, trusted him, followed his advice, built his career alongside him. Yet standing there now, he realized something painful. Sometimes the people closest to a story are also the ones who benefit most from controlling it. Behind him, Grace carefully closed the final folder. What happens next? She asked softly. Benjamin remained silent for several moments. Then he turned back toward her. For the first time since this journey began, there was certainty in his eyes. Next, he said quietly, I asked my uncle a question he has been avoiding for 34 years. Richard Crawford agreed to meet the following afternoon. The location was familiar. A private conference room on the top floor of Crawford Holdings headquarters. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the Chicago skyline. For decades, important decisions had been made in that room. Acquisitions, partnerships, expansions. Yet none carried the weight of the conversation that was about to take place. Benjamin arrived first. The silver watch rested on the table beside a folder containing copies of the documents they had uncovered. Grace sat quietly near the window. She had insisted on staying out of the discussion, but Benjamin wanted her present. Too much of the truth now belonged to both of them. 10 minutes later, Richard entered the room. At 72, he still carried himself with confidence. His suit was immaculate, his posture straight, the image of a respected businessman. For a moment, he smiled warmly at Benjamin. Then his eyes landed on the watch. The smile faded. I have not seen that in years, Richard said quietly. Benjamin studied him carefully. I know. Richard took a seat. You sounded serious on the phone. Benjamin nodded. I was. The older man glanced toward Grace. And who is this? Someone who helped me find answers. Richard's expression tightened slightly. Answers to what? Benjamin slid the photograph across the table. The one showing Thomas and Richard together after the date. Everyone claimed Thomas had disappeared. Richard looked at it. His face remained calm. Too calm. Where did you find this? Benjamin did not answer. Instead, he placed the deposition transcript beside it. Then the trust documents. Then the letter. One by one. The room grew quieter with each page. Richard looked at the evidence for a long time. Finally, he leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes. Not in anger. Not in fear. In exhaustion. I always wondered if someone would find it all someday, he said softly. Benjamin felt his heart pound. Then it is true. Richard opened his eyes. Parts of it. Benjamin's voice remained steady. Did my father abandon us? The answer came immediately. No. The single word seemed to echo through the room. Grace looked toward Benjamin. He remained completely still. Richard lowered his gaze. Thomas loved his family more than anyone I have ever known. Benjamin swallowed hard. Then why did he leave? Richard looked toward the skyline beyond the glass. For the first time, he appeared older than his years. Because he believed he was protecting people. Benjamin remembered the exact words from the letter. Protecting people. The same explanation. The same motive. Richard continued. There were financial disputes. Conflicts inside the company. Thomas uncovered things that threatened powerful interests. He became convinced that staying would place others at risk. Benjamin listened carefully. Including my mother? Richard nodded. Including your mother. Silence filled the room. Richard looked at Grace. Then back at Benjamin. What I did wrong was not letting the truth return when it should have. Benjamin stared at him. You let everyone believe he abandoned us. Richard lowered his head. I told myself I was protecting the company. Protecting the family. Eventually, the lie became easier than the explanation. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Then Benjamin reached for the watch and held it in his hands. 34 years of anger. 34 years of misunderstanding. 34 years spent blaming a man who had never stopped trying to come home. And in that moment, Benjamin realized something unexpected. The truth had finally arrived. Not with revenge. Not with triumph. Just with clarity. 3 months later, Chicago welcomed the first warm days of spring. The snow had disappeared from the sidewalks. Trees along the riverwalk carried fresh green leaves. The city seemed lighter somehow, as though winter had finally released its grip. On a quiet Saturday morning, Benjamin Crawford stood beneath the great clock inside Union Station. Travelers moved around him carrying luggage and coffee cups. Announcements echoed through the hall. Life continued exactly as it always had. Yet for Benjamin, everything felt different. For the first time in more than 3 decades, he no longer carried unanswered questions about his father. The truth had not erased the years of loss. It had not returned missed birthdays or forgotten conversations. But it had given something equally valuable. Peace. The investigation eventually confirmed what the letters, journals, and records had suggested from the beginning. Thomas Crawford had spent his final years protecting people he loved while preserving evidence he hoped would someday reveal the truth. His name was formally restored within the company archives. Public records were corrected. The family history that had once been built on assumptions was finally rebuilt on facts. Richard Crawford stepped away from public leadership soon afterward. There were no dramatic confrontations, no public scandals, no desire for revenge, only acknowledgement, responsibility, and the quiet acceptance that some mistakes cannot be undone, only understood. Benjamin preferred it that way. Some victories did not require headlines. Across the station, Grace Whitmore approached carrying 2 cups of coffee. She smiled as she handed one to him. "You are early." Benjamin laughed softly. "You say that every time." Grace took a seat beside him on one of the wooden benches. The same style of bench where Thomas had once sat all those years ago. For a moment, neither spoke. They simply watched people come and go. Children rushing to trains. Families reuniting. Travelers beginning new journeys. Grace glanced toward the silver watch on Benjamin's wrist. Still wearing it. Benjamin looked down at the watch and smiled. "Always." Then he carefully removed it and placed it in her hands. Grace looked surprised. "Benjamin, my father carried that watch while searching for a way home." His voice remained calm. "Your grandmother carried his story when nobody else would." Grace looked down at the worn silver case. The morning light reflected softly across the glass. "This belongs to your family." Benjamin shook his head. "It belongs to both of them." Grace felt emotion rise unexpectedly in her chest. Not because of the watch itself, but because of everything it represented. Kindness remembered. Loyalty honored. Truth protected across generations. Benjamin looked toward the station clock. "Funny, isn't it?" Grace smiled. "What?" A conversation that lasted less than 30 seconds changed both our lives. They sat quietly together as sunlight poured through the station windows. No mysteries remained. No hidden documents. No unfinished questions. Just understanding. Just gratitude. Just the simple realization that ordinary people often carry extraordinary pieces of history without ever knowing it. And somewhere in that busy station, surrounded by strangers moving in every direction, 2 families finally found the ending they deserved. Because sometimes the truth does not arrive like a storm. Sometimes it arrives quietly. In a forgotten journal. In an old photograph. In a watch that refuses to stop keeping time. And sometimes, the people who change our lives are the ones we almost never notice. If this story reminded you of someone whose kindness made a difference long after the moment had passed, share that thought below. And if you believe that truth, dignity, and quiet courage still matter, we hope you will stay with us for more stories like this. Until next time, remember that the smallest act of honesty can echo farther than anyone imagines.